This meeting is being recorded.
So as a reminder, we were first introduced to the figure of Isaiah in 2 Kings chapter 19. And we'll also consider the story that we encountered there again when it recurs later on in Isaiah. As a reminder, in this story, Hezekiah is held up as a good king who does what is right in the eyes of the Lord. And he at first refuses to capitulate to the king of Assyria. However, after seeing the king of Assyria take Samaria and, quote, carry the Israelites away to Assyria, he ultimately capitulates to the Assyrian king, giving him all the tribute he asks for, including stripping the temple of its silver and gold. This isn't enough for the Assyrian king, however, and he later sends his messengers who broadcast further threats before the people of Jerusalem. And when King Hezekiah hears of this, he rends his garments, covers himself with sackcloth, and calls for the prophet Isaiah, son of Amos. We can discern from this story that the king here is calling for Isaiah in his time of great need, that Isaiah was already a well-known and respected prophet, or at least respected in the sense of the person you would consult at a time of crisis. And so when we turn to our text of Isaiah now, we see in the first verses that Isaiah was a prophet who was active under 4 different kings. We had an extraordinarily long prophetic legacy, starting with King Uzziah, then Jotham, then Ahaz, and then Hezekiah. And Isaiah here is prophesying to the southern kingdom, so to Judah, and especially to the people of Jerusalem, although in these first few chapters, he also references Israel, and then we'll talk about that. So the book of Isaiah as a whole contains prophecies for several different audiences. So the first, and from our reading today, is him speaking to and often condemning the Judeans during the time of Assyria's initial interventions into the area that is now Palestine. Later, he'll speak to the exiles of Judah who are currently in Babylon. And lastly, to the Jewish community who returns from Babylon, but who begins to fall again return to their sinful ways. So our readings for this week are, of course, focusing on that first audience. And the important context here is that at the start of Isaiah's ministry, both kingdoms were enjoying economic prosperity and military strength, both the northern and southern kingdoms. Neither of them had yet fallen. However, there was internal corruption, as we read very vividly about in 2 Kings. That included idolatry, growing economic inequality, and especially the oppression of the poor and the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few, which Isaiah condemns explicitly in our readings for this week. And also hypocritical liturgical worship. So the vivid image from first Isaiah is of praying to God with blood on your hands in the temple. So externally, even at the start of Isaiah's ministry, Assyria was rising in power and beginning to make incursions into nearby territories. And by the end of Isaiah's ministry, much of the Near East had been forced under Assyrian rule. And we also read about, as we saw in 2 Kings, that conflict between, are the northern tribes going to turn to Egypt for protection against Egypt and Babylon for protection against Assyria? Are they going to turn to Babylon? So it's this combination of these 3 powers at play and wondering who is the one who's going to conquer, who's the one who's going to protect. But ultimately, we see this. The geography is such that it's either Egypt, Assyria, or Babylon, or so it seems. And of course, Isaiah's prophecies call into question whether reliance on any of those forces for protection against the other is really necessary. But anyway, so that gets us to some of the other surrounding context, which is the Syro-Ephraimite conflict. So that's the conflict that's especially with Aram and the northern kingdom forming an alliance against these bigger groups, and the question of whether the southern kingdom will join that alliance, the conquest of Samaria and the fall of the northern kingdom, and then lastly, the siege of Jerusalem by the Assyrian king. So before we turn to specific passages, I wanted to offer just one piece of framing that comes from A.J. Heschel. So if folks haven't had a chance to look at that text yet, the passages that I shared there, I think are the chapter I shared there, I think is extremely helpful, especially the first 20 pages, mainly because it gives a lot, or it summarizes in narrative form that context I tried to offer there in brief about what's going on with the different kings and the various powers at play. I found it to be the most helpful source for that. But this, the section that I have quoted here is from the introduction to this book that's on all of the prophets. And Heschel here is exploring kind of what manner of man is the prophet. And I think this extended quote here in particular is helpful for us as we try to read Isaiah and understand his message. So he writes, "To be a person endowed with prophetic sight, everyone else appears blind. To be a person whose ear perceives God's voice, everyone else appears deaf. No one is just, no one is strong enough, no trust is complete enough. The prophet hates the approximate, he shuns the middle of the road. Man must live on the summit to avoid the abyss. There is nothing to hold to except God. Carried away by the challenge, the demand to straighten out man's ways, the prophet is strange, one-sided, and unbearable extremist. Others may suffer from the terror of cosmic aloneness. The prophet is overwhelmed by the grandeur of divine presence. He is incapable of isolating the world. There's an interaction between God and man, which to disregard is an act of insolence. Isolation is a fairy tale. Where an idea is the father of faith, faith must conform to the ideas of a given system. In the Bible, the realness of God came first, and the task was how to live in a way compatible with his presence. Man's coexistence with God determines the course of history. The world's reality is contingent upon compatibility with God." And he goes on to cite there, especially the Psalms that describe, God, if God turns his face away, all of creation kind of turns back into dust. That the relationship with God is necessary actually for the existence of the world itself. And so this here, I think, offers a really helpful way, a way of reading Isaiah that reminds us of what's at stake here. And that's that human corruption of any form, and especially the interrelated hypocrisy of worship and idolatry and oppression of vulnerable people, all of these exist in this single fabric of what it means to be faithful to God. And failure in any one of these realms amounts to denial of reality. And that's where we see those images of creation itself participating in the destruction. Creation itself participating in the destruction that results from such action. And so so this is a whole big fabric that connects these disparate parts. And just as a bit of a teaser looking ahead, we'll look to Tobit to see at least one example of how these different aspects of the Mosaic law fit together in the life of a family. But first, we'll turn to particular passages from Isaiah.
Yeah, let's look together at first chapter 1, some of chapter 2, and 5 and 6. So chapter 1, and we'll discuss throughout here. And I'm not going to be hyper specific because chapter 1 really introduces the book as a whole. You see the main themes are kind of all here. And this is something that Brent Petrie in the introduction to the book of Isaiah gives us a little summary. And so I thought I would actually just quote a few sentences from that summary, just to cue us to think of what all the things that we would be finding here in this first chapter, starting at the beginning. So, and supposedly, well, tangent, so chapter 6 is where Isaiah gets that's his call story. So presumably this comes after chapter 6, but you have the beginning of this is appropriate for the beginning of a prophecy because of the line, "Hear, O heavens, and give ear, O earth, for the Lord has spoken." So imagine the heavens, like the court of heavens and all of creation being gathered for these lines. So to what Petrie was saying, especially in verses 2 through 11, the judgment, a disaster associated with covenant infidelity. And then the next several verses, 12 through 17, hypocritical worship, the worship, and let's look at particular passages, but like Emma was saying, God can't pay attention to sacrifices that are given with blood on the hands of those, blood on hands offered up. Starting in verse 18, an emphasis on repentance, restoration, and forgiveness. So and that'll be picked up more in chapter 2. But obviously, we keep recurring to a vision of the future, which could correspond to the restoration of Israel's fortunes, but also seems to suggest something larger and cosmic. Starting in verse 21, Zion as the bride of Yahweh. So again, something we're familiar with from the prophetic text we've read so far, the theme of infidelity as a sort of harlotry. And then starting in verse 28, a condemnation. Well, I guess that's sort of a repeat here, but a condemnation of those who are on the wrong side of this message. Although also in verse 18, you have an interesting come as Alter says, come pray, let us come to terms, the Lord said. So and then so some of the invitation that has to do with the restoration is put in covenantal terms as well.
So should we read maybe the first 9 or 8 verses together, or maybe verses 1 through 8 together and discuss?
Yeah.
Are there any volunteers to read verses 1 through 8 here? And I can pull it up on the screen. Okay, I'll go and read them. Yeah. So the vision of Isaiah, son of Amos, which he saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. Hear, O heavens, and give ear, O earth, for the Lord has spoken. Sons I have reared and brought up, but they have rebelled against me. The ox knows its owner, and the ass its master's crib, but Israel does not know, my people does not understand. Ah, sinful nation, a people laden with iniquity, offspring of evildoers, sons who deal corruptly. They have forsaken the Lord, they have despised the Holy One of Israel, they are utterly estranged. Why will you still be smitten that you continue to rebel? The whole head is sick, and the whole heart faint. From the sole of the foot even to the head, there is no soundness in it, but bruises and sores and bleeding wounds. They are not pressed out or bound up or softened with oil. Your country lies desolate, your cities are burned with fire, in your very presence, aliens devour your land. It is desolate, as overthrown by aliens, and the daughter of Zion is left like a booth in a vineyard, like a lodge in a cucumber field, like a besieged city. If the Lord of hosts had not left us a few survivors, we should have been like Sodom and become like Gomorrah. And then goes on to say, what is the multitude of your sacrifices to me? Can you open up just for reflections on those first verses?
Well, I found reading the Heschel article this afternoon was really helpful, because reading through Isaiah, I was getting confused as to which group he was talking about, because sometimes he was condemning Judah, and sometimes it seemed like he was condemning Assyria, and then back and forth, and then praising, and I was getting confused. But the Heschel article put it into context, I think, and it's a really good, well-written explanation. So I really think that's important. And then didn't have time to go back to read Isaiah again, but I think it would make more sense now, line by line, than it did before I knew what was going on.
Yeah, I found that reading helpful too. What do you guys think about how does this strike you, especially since this is not the first prophetic text we read in the last couple of weeks? His themes, his perspective.
Well, Isaiah is so passionate. Was this all written at the time? I mean, this wasn't written later saying, "Oh, this is what happened before." He's writing this at the time it's happening, I assume.
There's a couple of different interpretations there. I think the general consensus from all perspectives is that this is a compilation of prophecies, hence the fact that they don't go in order. That these would be different prophecies that have been stitched together onto a single scroll. And the reason for the different audiences, there's a couple of different ways of understanding it. The canonical understanding is that all of these are prophecies by a single person named Isaiah, but who has these predictives. He's speaking to the peoples who are in exile in the future from where he is. So a prophecy about the future. Others, of course, will say it's different figures who have all been subsumed under one name Isaiah. But in general, I would say that, yeah, these aren't all penned at the same time, even in the canonical reading, but rather are different prophecies that are put together with different people having different senses of where those breaks are.
I mean, I think that the tradition is that this is written at the time, not later, like what you're talking about here. And an interesting thing to think about is I can't find the footnote. I was looking at an altar here, but some of the prophecies are also put in verb tenses that are ambiguous. So you can't quite tell, is this happening? Is it about to happen? Is it contingent? And I think, according to Alter, that's sort of intentional. That's like part of the prophetic thing itself, is that this, in a way, the fabric of the world. I mean, just to use some of the Heschel imagery, like your sins are bringing this to pass, and that's just the way it is. But if you repent, like I think of Jonah. Jonah didn't say, like, this is conditional. It said this is happening, but it was still an invitation in the course of which it was found to be conditional.
Yeah, and the general consensus is that 1 through 39 were probably written by Isaiah at this time, but from 40 on is what's usually been called Deutero-Isaiah, or second Isaiah, that starting with comfort my people, that seems to have been written after the Babylonian exile, so by a different person. And then there's other theories, as Emma would say, of a third Isaiah and maybe a fourth. I don't think I've ever heard a fifth, but it's all a little up in the air, although there does seem to be a very definite break between 30 verses or chapter 40.
Yeah, when I was reading it, the thing that struck me was the beauty of the poetry. The luminosity of it. And of course, a lot of it is material that we, is a part of our tradition in so many ways too. So some of it's very familiar, but I felt that the kind of movement from, I won't call it comfort, but certainly these wide visions that are so beautiful, and then the condemnation at the same time. The beauty of the language really struck me.
Yeah,
That's especially interesting after having read Kings and Chronicles, which are written in a more newspaper type style, and now we're seeing the same things happening, but with the eyes of this passionate person that is calling down destruction at the same time offering hope. And on one page he says the Lord has no compassion on the fatherless and the widows, and on the next page he's saying that helping the widows and the fatherless. So he's just exploring it from every aspect, and not just telling the details of the cold details of what they did wrong, which is what the Kings and Chronicles did.
Yeah, I think along with that, for my own self, just my own personal response to all of this is that how much more memorable, how much more impactful, and how much, again, luminous the poetic part of Scripture is. And how, for me, the thing I found interesting as I was thinking about that today is how little poetry we have in the New Testament. There's language that's luminous, there's language that's beautiful, but not very much that's poetic. It is there, but not a lot. And I find that really, really interesting in terms of my visceral response to the poetic parts of the Old Testament that we've been reading. Just my thoughts.
Yeah, and thanks for drawing our attention there, Leah. Robert Alter points out a few ways of reading, especially some of the conventions of Hebrew poetry that might be worth pointing out as a guide for reading. I think we've talked about them before, but basically that Hebrew poetry is written in 2-verse groups where, and you can see this all over the place here, where the second line often intensifies the line that came before or renames, and you'll see the lines are kind of divided into 2 parts. So in this case, the ox knows its owner, the ass its master's crib. And in this case, of course, animal, human being the parallelism there, but intensification, that the ox doesn't just know its owner. And I think the Alter translation is master's. I think it's his master's stall. Basically, so not only does this animal know its owner, it knows the kind of dwelling place of its owner. In a way that even intensifies the line that came before. Or here's a kind of more straightforward renaming, but Israel does not know, my people does not understand. So that the echoing of the line that came before that plays with naming and renaming as well as intensification. And so keeping that in mind too can also help us, I think fully appreciate what we have here in terms of poetic devices, and also make sense of some of the synonyms.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we see that in things like the Magnificat too. It's there as well, and I think that it helps to reinforce why some of those readings are so powerful, and why we use it liturgically, as well.
Yeah, as Petrie points out, the book of Isaiah is used more often in the Gospel of Mark in the lectionary readings for the Catholic Church. Says something of the prominence of this text for, I think one of the reasons being the one that you just named, or the fact that it was nicknamed the 5th Gospel by the early Church. Again, testifying to its prominence in the Christian imagination.
So I've just been reading a book called The 5th Gospel about Christian interpretations of Isaiah, and it has some fairly interesting things. He claims that Isaiah is the book of the Old Testament that's most quoted in the New, with the possible exception of Psalms, and so much has been interpreted as prophesying the life of Jesus. He even did like a 2-page gospel telling the story of Jesus, all from Isaiah, which was a really interesting perspective. I could make a copy and send that on if people might be interested.
Yeah, please do.
Sure.
Yeah.
So more particularly, I mean, obviously, chapter 1 is rich poetically and in terms of content in every way, but the critique of the liturgy, I love putting this in, taking it for granted, as it seems like we should, that he's not saying you should not do the liturgy anymore, that the temple shouldn't exist, but there's all this extreme language about the temple service without compassion, without ethics, without a unity of life, because God vouchsafes for the unity of the cosmos, and that includes all of these things. So if you think that you can just go through the motions, then yeah, I mean, it's obviously a sort of a trope to make this critique, but he does it so forcefully that yeah, I find it quite moving.
Yeah.
And I think as we go along too, I think it's interesting to look at some of this in conjunction with the call story, where there's some temple images there too. And we'll get to that in a minute.
Yeah, and I really appreciate, and Heschel draws this out too, that how Isaiah writes about the weariness of God, and you see that in the section, especially on the liturgical life of the Israelites, where it's your new moons and appointed feasts my soul hates, and this is God speaking, and they've become a burden to me. I am weary of bearing them. So imagine that or I think that might be the words of Isaiah here. No, it's still in the my. So yes, that's the words of God there, that worship becomes a burden. It's just so beautiful.
Yeah.
Well,
Such a change from previous books in the Old Testament's attitudes towards worship, where, doing the worship correctly is the be all and end all in so many of those books. So this is Isaiah, I think, is a watershed.
Well, it's a return, right? Because Deuteronomy would certainly not. I don't think you could bear out in Deuteronomy, for example, or Exodus, when you see those connections between liturgical practice and ethical injunction. But I do see what you're saying, especially when we get to the historical books. I think we see those indisputably becoming disconnected. But I would say I think this strikes me as like a return to the fundamental understanding that we're presented with in the Pentateuch in a lot of ways.
A few years ago, when the pandemic hit and church doors closed across the country, and both in the liturgy of the hours and in the readings right around that time, I don't remember whether they're from Isaiah or not. They might have been from another prophetic text, but there was these texts about how, in fact, one of them even said, shut the doors of the temple courts, don't come here anymore. And I did a lot of reflecting at that time about we're observant Catholics and we do our thing in church, but if our lives aren't corresponding, what does that actually mean? Especially as, this was suddenly being imposed by circumstances. It was kind of a very moving thing to imagine that text suddenly applied to 21st century America, and wondering how relevant this text could be in many ways.
Yeah, and we'll talk about this in a little bit after we look at least maybe jumping to chapter 6 of Isaiah, or whatever you think. But when we turn to Tobit, we'll see that we start to see the corpus of the corporal works of mercy start to kind of come into view in Tobit. And of course it's at a time of exile, when the question is okay, temple worship isn't possible. So there's this different impulse toward still an insistence on worship, of course, that we see in Tobit, but that sanctification in other parts of life, the necessity of that becomes very clear when you can no longer worship in the way that you had before.
So if there's anything someone especially wants to bring up from chapter 2 or intervening chapters, please do. But let's move to chapter 5. So at the beginning of chapter 5, the Song of the Vineyard. So it's very interesting, of course, to look at this after having read the Song of Songs. There seems to be a similarity. Robert Alter thinks that this gives reason for us for the Song of Songs to be interpreted as God and Israel, and not just interpersonally, romantically. So and then obviously it seems that Jesus in the parable of the talents is referring to this too, although it takes a very different key there, you could say, where it seems more economic than personal. Let's read this together. Let me sing to my beloved the song of my lover for his vineyard. A vineyard my beloved had on a hillside rich in soil, and he hoed it and took off its stones and planted it with choice vines. And he built a tower in its midst, and a winepress too he hewed in it. And he hoped to get grapes, but it put forth rotten fruit. And now, O dweller of Jerusalem and man of Judah, judge, pray, between me and my vineyard. What more could be done for my vineyard that I did not do? Why did I hope to get grapes and it put forth rotten fruit? And now let me inform you, pray, what I am about to do to my vineyard. Take away its hedge, and it shall turn to waste. Break down its fence, and it shall be trampled. And I will make it a wild field, and it shall not be pruned nor raked, and thorns and thistles shall spring up. And after that, we have the woes to those who put houses together, those who drink too much, and there's that long list. So we'll get to that in a minute. But yeah, any thoughts about the vineyard?
Does this remind us of the Christ condemning the fig tree for not giving out fruit when he was walking down the road?
I don't think in a very particular way, because the fig tree isn't cultivated, or its cultivation is not talked about there. But I don't know. Do you see it more that way?
Well, I mean, nonetheless, the importance of the image of the fruit that something bears, and so of course the thematic connection is there.
Yeah. Well, the vineyard. What makes it a vineyard is in a sense is this protection to the hedgerow that's around it, and that's a major image for. So it's God who put the hedgerow around it and allow it to take the form of grapes as opposed to wild grapes. But he's taking it away. So it's sort of like you've gone wild. Well, I'll show you what wildness looks like. It's the Assyrians coming in and trampling it. So yeah. So I think I think for me, what first those images of love as protection, not just expectation, but the expectation and protection going together.
What it reminded me of is two New Testament things in the one sense, again, which doesn't focus as much on cultivation, but the dishonest tenants of the vineyard. You have that thing where the owner is planting his vineyard, and even I think, is it true that he talks about building a tower and digging out a wine press, all these same usages in that one, but then the tenants, in this case, is not the fault of the vines, it's the tenants who won't provide any fruit at the proper time. But then also reminds me of Jesus weeping over Jerusalem. It's like, how I would have gathered you in and protected you under my wings, and you would not, and you'll be cast down, the walls broken down, because you would not come under my protection. So kind of a similar usage there in the New Testament.
Yeah, and this theme that we've been talking about, that to return to a wasteland or to return to something like a wilderness is both obviously here a punishment, but also what we don't see as much here, but we see the theme that's brought out in much of Isaiah is also the only hope of purification. And so they're thinking about the wandering of Israel in the wilderness on, and again, that Brueggemann article that at least I keep mentioning, about what's necessary as we go from Egypt to the promised land. There needs to be that place to unlearn the ways of Egypt and that time to do so. So that's always looming large for me, especially if we think back to the reading that our first presenter gave of Genesis 2, where the invitation to see the exile from the garden also as a kind of opportunity for rehabilitation. And so here, of course, vineyard being the cultivated space and garden being, a cultivated space. I think there's lots of echoes and parallels to see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that reminds me, we haven't talked yet about the sprinkled in here is the language of the remnant. Oh gosh, is that in chapter 5 as well?
The stump.
Yeah, the stump, is that chapter? Maybe that's chapter,
It's chapter 6.
yeah. Well, maybe, yeah, let's move to chapter 6 because we'll have to move on to Tobit soon anyway. So chapter 6, though this is, well, yeah, let's just read the beginning of it again. In the year of the death of King Uzziah, I saw the master seated on a high and lofty throne. The skirts of his robe filled the temple. Seraphim were stationed over him, 6 wings for each one. With 2 it would cover its face, and with 2 it would cover its feet, and with 2 it would hover, and each called out to each and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of armies. The fullness of all earth is his glory. And the pillars of the thresholds swayed from the voice calling out, and the house was filled with smoke. And I said, Woe to me, for I am undone. For I am a man of impure lips, and in a people of impure lips do I dwell. My eyes have seen the King, Lord of armies. And one of the seraphim flew down to me, and in his hand a glowing coal in tongs that he had taken from the altar. And he touched my mouth and said, Look, this has touched your lips, and your crime is gone. Your offense shall be atoned. And I heard the voice of the master saying, Whom shall I send, and who will go for us? And I said, Here I am, send me. And he said, Go and say to this people, Indeed, you must hear, but you will not understand. And I'll leave off there because it's essentially what Jesus was quoting, and what we used as the opening prayer. But I'll skip a few verses back to what Emma was just referring to, the end of chapter 6. And the Lord shall drive man far away, and abandonment grow in the midst of the land. And yet a 10th part shall be in it and turn back. And it shall be ravaged like a terebinth and an oak, which though felled have a stump within them. The holy seed is its stump. Yeah, so obviously some themes here that we see taken up as central ways of understanding the promise of Christ. Yeah, so let's open up so this will be our final little pocket of discussion on Isaiah. I was really struck by thinking about the critique of the cult here, that it's interesting that in Isaiah's call, you have a coal that's taken from the altar, and that coal, and so presumably this is the altar of heaven, but of course a reference to Jerusalem as well. And so this coal, and this is a burning coal, and it's purifying. So you have that sense that true worship should be purifying us. It shouldn't be something that would allow us to maintain this life of impurity, like manifested in vice. Anyway, so that's something that struck me, because obviously we have a vision of God that is a vision of worship here too. Also, people have thoughts, our perennial question about, does God harden people's hearts that we've had, since Exodus, that we had in the Matthew passage read, and obviously here, and how that works with the prophetic message, which seems to be somewhat reflexively aware of what's happening.
Yeah, that's what I was quoting before in chapter 9, in the part called Judgment on Arrogance and Oppression. He doesn't even have compassion on the fatherless and widows at that point, because every mouth speaks folly. So the corruption has spread to the whole culture, not just the leaders.
One reading, I can't remember which commentary it was in, that I appreciated that makes of this is when we're still troubling, but found insightful. Is when he says, and he said, go and say to this people, hear and hear, but do not perceive, see and see, or do not understand, see and see, but do not perceive. That it's that potentially the prophetic message is itself the agent of that hardness of heart and heavy eyes. That sort of, if you listen to like the intensity, as we've been saying, of Isaiah, and it's sort of this relentless intensity, that the people become numb to it. And that somehow it's like the prophetic message is at once the kind of only thing that might have a chance of waking people up. And on the other hand, it's also, if you hear it too much and it lands on deaf ears, you lose sensitivity even to the most extreme of language and the most graphic of images, the most harrowing of words. And so I found that to be, helpful or insightful, that it's the prophetic message can do both of those things. And whether it sort of sensitizes you or desensitizes you is dependent upon your response to that message. Because it's to the nth degree, it's kind of the last hope, at least that words could offer.
Mhm.
I like to think of it from our own position as priest, prophet, and king, right? That is part of our own call as people of the gospel. What does it mean to be a person who's called to be a prophet, right? Obviously, we're not called to be Isaiah per se, but we're called to this prophetic role. And I think what I hear in this is this, the beyond the need for purification, which I do think is an aspect, this reality that when we are sent, what we are going to find is this hardness of heart out there, and that we might find our words are spoken and not understood, that we point to something and not perceived, and that we're stuck in this kind of this morass. Sometimes it feels like when we're trying to feel or we're trying to speak the word, a prophetic word, and that our next comment after we go out is to be this next number 11, how long, oh Lord? Like the reality is that I think about Phil Berrigan as an example, someone who's just been years and years and years of trying to speak prophetically. And I'm sure he has said that, how long, oh Lord, right? And so I think that for me, I find it very inspiring and also challenging to be willing to hold that tension of when I accept within myself the prophetic call, I should expect it not to be heard and for me to be frustrated for a long time and have to speak it forever, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I don't think it matters whether we're speaking about economic, new economic models or how people are treated or what it means to pray. I think it's all of the same frustration and complication. So I find this very inspiring.
Yeah. I completely agree with Leah. And something it reminds me of is to go back to chapter 1, the very beginning of chapter 1. What is the first critique? Sons I have nurtured and raised, but they rebelled against me. The ox knows its owner and the donkey its master's stall. Israel did not know, my people did not pay heed. So the prophet gets to partake in God's experience of his people, and basically that they don't know him. And of course, what is the prologue to John, the Gospel of John? He came into the world, but his people knew him not. So it's like, as you said, Leah, the priest, we are participating in the reality in the ministry of the Son of God, and this is God's experience of us.
Well, shall we turn to Tobit with our last couple of minutes here? So to start by offering, so like I said, there's a lot of connected themes here, and Tobit is alive, at the same time that Isaiah would be prophesying, or about the same time. But I'll start with some context on Tobit, and then hopefully we can get into some of the related themes. So first, Tobit is the story of an Israelite. So before we were focusing on the southern kingdom, on Judea, in Judah, with the prophet Isaiah. Now we're back in the north. So Tobit is the story of an Israelite or northern family from the clan of Naphtali, and their experience of the earlier Assyrian exile. So they're exiled in Nineveh in Assyria, but it's prior to the definitive capture of Samaria and the total exile of the northern tribes. So a bit of some verses from 2 Kings to help situate us historically. So in the 52nd year of Azariah, king of Judah, Pekah, son of Ramlah, began to reign over Israel and Samaria, and he reigned 20 years. And he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. He did not depart from the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, which made Israel to sin. And the days of Pekah, king of Assyria, came and captured all of these cities, all the land of Naphtali, and he carried the people captive to Assyria. So this is the experience of Tobit as one of these people from the clan of Naphtali being carried away to Assyria. Sorry, too many screens.
I just wanted to, I had a comment just on the thing as a whole, especially with Angel Raphael, with the, it reminds me of, was it 2 or 3 years ago, we had the Tolstoy readings, and Tolstoy's story, what is it, the way, What Men Live By, where the angel comes and lives with the shoemaker, and
Yeah.
experiences all what it's like to live with the shoemaker and all his problems and everything, and then helps bring resolution to it. With I think Tolstoy may have been inspired by Tobit.
Yeah. So a bit more context before we open it up fully for discussion, but I think it's a great connection, Mary. Is that one helpful way to think of Tobit, I think, is as is like Tobit is to what Second Kings what Ruth was to the book of Judges. So if we're in the time of Second Kings and there's all of this chaos and demoralizing stories of the behavior of the Israelites, in the book of Judges, we then got this glimpse into what the life of one faithful Israelite family amidst this upheaval. And the book of Tobit is really the same thing for Second Kings. And so as Tobit himself tells us in chapter 1, his family refused to participate in the schism of Jeroboam. So you can remember the story of Jeroboam and his liturgical reforms that he inaugurated after the split of the two kingdoms. And I'm going to read this in full because I think it's really helpful for understanding the book of Tobit and its understanding of worship. And Jeroboam said in his heart, this is right after the schism, now the kingdom will turn back to the house of David. If this people go up to offer sacrifices in the house of the Lord at Jerusalem, then the heart of this people will turn again to their Lord, to Rehoboam, king of Judah, and they will kill me and return to Rehoboam, king of Judah. So the king took counsel and made 2 calves of gold. And he said to the people, you've gone up to Jerusalem long enough. Behold your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Of course, echoing the words of Aaron. And jumping down a bit, and Jeroboam appointed a feast on the 15th day of the 8th month, like the feast that was in Judah, and he offered sacrifices upon the altar. So he did in Bethel, sacrificing to the calves that he had made. And he placed in Bethel the priests of the high places that he had made, and he went up to the altar which he had made, in the month of which he had devised of his own heart. I'll go leave it there. I emphasize those last lines because it reminds me of the critique that we read about in Isaiah, of people making their idols, and in the end, worshiping not only what they had made, but and ultimately really worshiping themselves. So this is the important context, liturgical context for the book of Tobit. So Tobit's family, amidst all of this, refused to worship in the way that Rehoboam was instructing them to, and instead continued to go to Jerusalem covertly. So even in this context, he continues to observe the Mosaic law as faithfully as he can, including both liturgical prayer and offering in what we now think of the works of mercy, as we mentioned earlier. In fact, we see in this text the early stages of the development of both the corporal works of mercy, especially here, feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, burying the dead, and the church's Lenten practice. It's actually in this text that for the first time, we see the triad of prayer, fasting, and almsgiving being grouped together in an explicit way. So in so doing, the author of the book of Tobit shows us what living the full fabric of the law looks like: the coherence of right worship, right use of money, respect for family, purity laws, especially when the relationship between these is understood properly and, in this case, really organically. So the key example of that in the book of Tobit is, of course, that Tobit leaves his Passover meal to go bury the dead when he gets that call. He sleeps outside afterward because of his respect because he's touched the corpse. So now he's ritually unclean. And in so doing, he's not at all, of course, diminishing the value of the Passover meal, but showing us what it means to live from it, a glimpse of that fulfillment or the filling to overflowing that we see in Christ's life and ministry in relation to liturgical practice. So of course, Tobit suffers in a very Job-like way as a direct result of his good action. This sleeping outside after burying the corpse to preserve the cleanness of his house, means that bird droppings infect his eyes, which cause him to be blind. And it's this blindness that precipitates the narrative action of the story. In the suffering and in Tobit's despairing response to it, like I said, we can hear echoes of the book of Job, along with so many other biblical stories over the course of the narrative as a whole. So we can identify moments when the story of Tobit seems to recapitulate the lives of Isaac, the blind father in exile, and his relationship to his firstborn son, Jacob with his love for his wife, and his prolonged attainment with his new in-laws, Joseph, the Israelite who finds himself in a position of favor under a foreign ruler. And lastly, of course, and important for us, given our theme for this year, is the story of Tobit and especially Tobias offers a profound image of the covenant family making through marriage, including its explicit meditation in the prayer in the bedroom, on this prayer that invokes the story of Adam and Eve and this kind of undoing of the story of Adam and Eve that we see in marriage, and a rare insight into the everyday demands that the bonds of this covenant family making creates in the lives of these families. So this responsibility to in-laws, the sharing of wealth, all of these interrelated sets of responsibilities as Tobias is fulfilling his role as a kinsman redeemer for his beloved wife, Sarah. So I'll go ahead and leave it there in terms of an overview of the book of Tobit, but would love to discuss this text with you all.
Oh, it was so beautiful. Oh, I love Tobit. I'm so glad to have read Tobit just sit and read it. It was so lovely, and all the reasons that you brought up, but just as a narrative, it's just such a beautiful narrative. So, and I love the fact that there was a dog. Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, the at least the commentary I was reading points out the similarity between this and Odysseus's dog who recognizes the beggar.
Right.
Yeah. The few favorable, or I think it said actually the one favorable mention of a dog in the Old Testament, not a scavenger of corpses.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which is actually pretty interesting. Maybe that might have some kind of extra meaning, that kind of the paradisical connection.
Yeah, the lion laying down with the lamb and all of that. Yeah.
I thought there's I think it's where Tobias is trying to comfort his wife and saying, God's angel will go with him, not meaning in that very literal sense, like and that line where the angel's saying, are you looking to, like, he wants to know his name, and the angel says, are you looking to hire a name and family, or are you looking to hire someone to go with your son? I mean, I don't know. There's kind of this really beautifully hilarious kind of God intervening in this way. It's got to be one of the best books in the Old Testament in so many different ways.
Yeah, and the parental reactions, right, of Sarah's father digging the grave for Tobit before he even knows he's dead. But then also the insight into the marital conflict between Tobit and Anna and their different responses to the disappearance of their son. Calm down, Anna, he's coming back. It's so human and funny in that humanity.
Yeah, I really like Tobit. Two things. One is sort of the parallel with Antigone, and Tobit's defying the king by burying the dead. That they're in some ways almost parallel stories. And then the other thing, it was Tobiah wedding Sarah, but there's no well here. Unlike the all of those stories in the books of Moses, where the husband or his representative meets the prospective bride at the well. I wonder why the well didn't appear here.
think it was a missed opportunity for this. For this. Yeah.
Mhm.
What does anyone, one question I always have when reading this book, does anyone have any thoughts? Is it just kind of an interesting element in the story, or is the fish that has all these strange beneficial properties, but is apparently a dangerous creature? I mean, like, what are we supposed to make anything of it, or is it just an interesting kind of fairy tale like plot device, especially the connection to, like, driving away demons and stuff? Because, like, they burn the fish's entrails, but you can see that it's actually Raphael chasing the demon away. So what is the purpose in this narrative of the fish, other than just being a good fun part of the story?
One thing I think is that the prophet Jonah looms over this story. So there's a couple of references to Jonah, and the Hebrew in Jonah is actually Jonah swallowed by a big fish, not a whale. And so the big fish here, I think, is partially a reference to Jonah. And of course, like Christians have been reading this story Christologically for a very long time. And Jonah is one of the reasons for the story of the fish being a symbol of Christ, Christ in the belly of the fish. And so I think, of course, if you kind of take in that big picture, I think we can make a lot of the fish in the context of later symbols. But yeah, I guess I was reading that as Jonah, but then also this sort of is, at least with the eyes being healed, it seems like there's not that same ambiguity about, like, is it the efficacy of the smell? Is it the fish itself? So sort of is the angel giving? Yeah, the angel seems to here be giving, like, sound naturopathic advice. At the same time as, of course, the angel is actively intervening in this healing.
Mm-hmm. Until you mentioned it, I had just entirely forgotten that, of course, Jonah is preaching to Nineveh, which is where they are. I mean, like, this is like that's actually a really interesting connection when you take that into account. Yeah,
and they'd be very close together in time, if not exactly overlapping in context. So yeah, very, very similar narrative context.
Well, I have to admit not getting to Tobit, and I'm really regretting it now because it sounds like such a great story. And so my appetite is heightened to get to it, and I'm sorry for that, because I'm not can engage in this part of the conversation. But I am kind of struck overall by the conversation tonight, and also Isaiah, and which seems to me to be kind of a primer on how to live under oppressive regimes, and his admonishment to people not to emulate the oppressor, not to emulate the temporal power that's governing them, and to stay true to their religious identity, which I think is a theme that carries over, that threads throughout Old Testament scripture, and of course into the New Testament, where we see the theme played out in the life of Christ. In any case, that's my kind of stand back impression of the book of Isaiah, and I wish I could comment on Tobit, which I'm dying to read now.
When we were reading Ruth, somebody said that was called, like, the only book in the Bible with all good people, but I think Tobit could be put in there too.
Yeah, actually, and I realized it's Alter who said that, and Alter wouldn't be reading the book of Tobit because it's not in the Hebrew Bible.
Oh.
So I think that was Alter's quip. So you're right. I think he would have to admit Tobit if unless you count the demon. But yeah. And I think no, I really appreciate that comment, Mark. And it reminds me again. Sorry, I keep bringing up this Brueggemann article, but it's really shaped how I read. And his read there of the importance of liturgy, and especially to the call to remember that we see in Exodus. And so I think here, where we see this combination of the importance of liturgy, right? It's that, Tobit is celebrating the Passover meal. So he's reading the story of the Exodus as he hears word that more Israelites have been slaughtered by the Assyrian king in a fit of rage. And so thinking about that together, like what's the story Tobit is hearing in this moment, and how is that reflected in his action? I think that's just such a beautiful moment of like recognition of like, what is the importance of telling these stories and these reminders of, remember, I am the God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, and to see that really lived out here with this interrelationship.
Yeah, I think this book is underread because it does feel like it hits so much of what the Christian life should look like in so many different ways. I mean, I feel like it would be such a great primer for like RCIA or something like that. There's just so much in there to talk about regarding sacramental life, regarding prayer, regarding works of mercy, regarding covenant, regarding relationships, regarding the presence of the divine in our life through the angel. I mean, there's so much in there that I find so beautiful, and I think we talk about Ruth a lot, but I find this book underappreciated from the Christian perspective.
I like that, Leah. I'm gonna remember that for RCIA reading. Right?
We'll have to get Catherine to read Tobit.
Yeah.
Maybe that'll be the thing that
Yeah.
finally does it.
She's in a remote island off of Massachusetts
Reading
right
Shakespeare right now. So.
Yeah.
Good for her.
Yeah. But she let us know still praying Compline. So.
Good for her.
On the computer tonight?
No, she's
Yeah.
not, Dawn. She's not here. Yeah. 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 Well, we have a few minutes left. So if there's any final comments on Tobit. Yeah, and I think, Leah, to that too, I think it's a beautiful example of the like biblical imagination here. Like you mentioned these little echoes of all of the patriarchs that we've been reading about, and how their stories sort of those same motifs come back too, but in this case, an entirely virtuous manner. Yeah.
Well, and I think after so much reading of the unvirtuous, it's so refreshing to see what it could look like in a sense. And also how it happens in this simple person, right? I mean, yes, he's not, totally an Anna Williams, so to speak, but just an average person's life, and that virtue being lived out after all this, all the rich and powerful who just can't seem to find a way to do that very well. That also struck me.
Yeah, and doing this from exile.
Yeah, absolutely.
All this is developed in that. Yeah, is developed in that context, and how I think that's particularly instructive for us.
And for our time. A lot. This is really a book for our time.
Mm-hmm.
Well, on that note, maybe we should wrap up. And so for next week, I'm just going to pull up our calendar. We'll continue with Isaiah. And as I mentioned, we will talk about the remaining chapters of our reading for this week. So especially looking at Isaiah as that fifth gospel as we get into the prophecies of Emmanuel, of the virgin birth. And so Harry, if you want to share those, the readings that you mentioned for next week, I think that would aid our discussion. We'll also continue with our reading of the minor prophets. As you'll see, we'll jump between texts because those books are so short. So we'll be covering Joel, Nahum, and Habakkuk for next week. And so we'll see how much of that we actually tackle in Thursday's discussion. And we'll figure out exactly what our Thursday discussion will focus on to give people a chance to really focus on the text that we'll be highlighting. It'll definitely be the Isaiah, but we'll let you know especially which of the minor prophets seem to make the most sense to draw out in case you don't get to all of that by next week. And Mark, if you'd like to chime in on Tobit for next week, we'll very much welcome it, I'm sure. So. Well, thank you all, and we will see you on Saturday for the prayer service.
Okay, thank you so much.
Can I ask you a question, Emma, after the meeting?
Oh, yeah, we'll stay on.
Okay. Thanks, sweet.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.